Good evening, everyone. I'm Sakshi Wadhwa from the editorial team of TheDaak. With great delight, I welcome you all to the ninth session of TheDaak, a forum of digital conversations that delve into a variety of academic themes. The Batak is a humble attempt to build a community of young scholars, budding thinkers, readers, and writers who wish to critically engage with socio-political and cultural subject matters, thereby opening horizons for new ideas and enriching conversations. Today's discussion is titled Communication in the Age of Digital Fascism. Using Philippines as a case study, this talk will integrate the ways in which fascist narratives can be reinforced by progressive communication through current digital media infrastructure that encourages soundbite culture. It proposes that communication, which directs its energy towards methodologically recognizing genuine needs and enters the realm of solutions and community, is more likely to be successful in achieving its goals. Communicators who seek to organize actions between polarized groups must dissect the internal logics of different demographics, especially soft supporters, in order to build a baseline for meaningful engagement and inclusive consensus. Today, we are pleased to welcome Eugenie R. Huibonhoa as our speaker. Ms. Huibonhoa is a writer, narrative strategist, and political communicator from the Philippines, currently based in London. Recognized as a 2023 Asia Pacific Obama leader, she has worked across government and advocacy sectors focusing on health, gender, and human rights. She holds an MSc in Politics of Conflict, Rights and Justice from SOAS University of London and a degree in psychology from Ateneo de Manila University. We're also very delighted to have Sakshi Sharda as our discussant today. Ms. Sakshi is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Law, SOAS, and is a recipient of the prestigious UBEL DTP scholarship. She has worked as the editorial consultant for the Taylor and Francis Group, as a research associate in the Social Policy Research Foundation, SPRF, and as a teaching fellow at Ashoka University. Ms. Sharda is currently working on her thesis titled An Ethnographic Study of Emotions in the Family Courtroom, a case study of Punjab and Haryana. Her doctoral research is trying to shed light on how political emotions are employed as tools to discipline female litigants within the folds of acceptable femininity within family courtrooms in India, thereby exploring the intersection of law, political philosophy, and gender. The forum is now open for our speaker and discussants to engage. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll also introduce Chetna, who's our discussant also for this session. Chetna is just going to start her master's in political science from the Center for Political Studies at JNU. And Eugenie, whenever you're ready, we can go ahead with the presentation.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Oh, well, good afternoon in Delhi, I believe. But good morning from my side of the world. Thank you so much for coming out today to discuss what I feel is a very urgent topic. So I'm just going to share my screen. Oops. Sorry, and I hope you sorry, if you could give me a few seconds to set this up. Okay. Are you able to see the whole presentation?
Yes, we're able to see it.
Okay, great. Okay. So I've changed the title of the talk just a bit from communication in the age of digital fascism to communicating in the age of digital fascism, just to put an emphasis on kind of the momentum or like the inertia I'd like for you to take away from this conversation that we'll have today. So there are four parts to this talk. I'd first talk about the Philippine government, give you a bit of context, and show you kind of where I'm drawing my own observations and my own frustrations and my own experience as well. We'll delve into what digital fascism is exactly and how it works, how it functions, why it's important to consider the soundbite and its role in communication and social media, in the current landscape, and finally the realm of community, which I feel you've probably heard of already before, but I'd really like to share a bit of insight into how exactly we can create or foster community that is truly inclusive beyond what we currently believe it should look like. It's the Philippine government. As much as I've tried to run away from the government, I still keep on coming back to it. I can't stop thinking about it. So the Philippine government is similar to the US system. So we have three co-equal branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. So the legislative has the Senate and the House of Representatives. The executive has the president. The judiciary is the Supreme Court. So we have the upper and the lower chambers of Congress. And I personally work at the Senate of the Philippines. So in the Philippines, we only have 24 senators. And this is particularly what makes our senators so influential and so powerful, is because there are only 24 of them, compared to, say, the US, where I think, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but there are hundreds of senators, each representing a different state or a different part of the US. In the Philippines, you only have 24 to represent all our 7,000 plus islands. So I personally I worked for a senator who was the chairperson on the Committee on Health, the Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality. She was the deputy minority leader, the country's first democratic socialist senator, and she was the only opposition senator to be reelected in the 19th Congress. So on the lower left is a picture of me giving a speech at a political rally. Yeah, I think to 300 or 400 people. And just a fun fact, every time I'd step on stage, I'd lose 3,000 calories because I was so nervous and my heart would be like beating at a unhealthy rate. But just to say that kind of the observations and frustrations that I'll be talking about today kind of stem from this electoral campaign, from working in government during the pandemic. And I think I'll be a bit more clear as I go through the presentation. So I'll introduce you to some notorious figures in Philippine politics, just for a bit of context. So you have the Dutertes and the Marcoses. So both are very strong, very influential political families. And I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. I hope you do. But here in the middle, in the lower left, is our current president, Bongbong Marcos. To the right is Vice President Sara Duterte, and at the back is former President Rodrigo Duterte. So Rodrigo Duterte, in case you don't know about him, he's currently in the custody of the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. He instigated the war on drugs. It was his #1 policy during his administration. And this man was a very colorful president. He cursed at everyone, loved rape jokes, swore and cursed and flirted on live television. Very notorious figure. So he will be tried actually in September, at The Hague. And hopefully, we get the justice, the country gets the justice that it deserves. Unfortunately, still, despite all this, he remains a contested figure. He's actually quite beloved still. He holds so much political influence in the country, and that's precisely why his daughter is the current vice president. On the lower right, there's two men here. The left is, as I said, our current president, who is the son of the man on the right, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who is the ousted dictator of the Philippines. He was ousted through a nonviolent, a peaceful revolution that inspired a series of nonviolent movements across the world, including the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it was a really historic moment, not just for the country, but for revolutions across the world. But hundreds of thousands were disappeared. The desaparecidos, if you're familiar, With the term, they are political enemies of the administration who simply disappear, and up to now, hundreds of thousands of them have not been found. Their bodies have not been found. Many were tortured, many were raped. He had a 20-year dictatorship, right? And it was the people power revolution that finally saw an end to his dictatorship. Despite that history, unfortunately, his son is again the current president, and so we can talk about that a bit more later and see exactly how that happened. But what the two share, other than a political alliance, which is now falling, which has actually truly fallen apart, is that they both are clients of Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica is a British political analyst group, and I think in around 2018, I think along with WikiLeaks, though I'd have to verify that, but it was revealed that Facebook had shared information or users' data of Filipinos to Cambridge Analytica. And this was very instrumental in electing Rodrigo Duterte as president and also rebranding the Marcos image, making it possible for the martial law memory to be heavily contested again. So now people are framing that era as the golden age. Right. And so both of these figures, both of these contentious figures, have taken advantage of the social media infrastructure. And we'll talk about how exactly that infrastructure establishes itself, how exactly it entrenches fascism, and why it's one of the most important forms of fascism that we need to consider today, right? So digital fascism is a term coined by Christian Fuchs. And Imbong, in the reading that I had sent entitled Fascism and the Omnipresence of Communication, argues that the state retains a centering role in organizing fascism by instrumentalizing the technical specifications of communications technology. So although the internet seems like a fluid, anonymous system that continues to replicate itself because of a public that continues to interact with it, you can't ignore the role of the state, right? The state continues through its institutions, through its organizations to fund how discourse is distributed on social media, right? A study in Brazil also as well. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical problem. Okay. Great. Okay. So in Brazil, they had actually discovered that there's an allied dictatorship, an allied partnership between the fascist party, the bureaucracy, the army, and big business. So the reason why Brazil's dictator continues to sustain power is precisely because it's backed by big money, by the institution, by people with financial and profitable interests in retaining the dictatorship. And so rather than thinking of what occurs on social media as simply reliant on the public, on users, on us, it's important to consider the role of the state as well. So digital fascism is inherently, or rather fascism, despite its many definitions, is still relies on propaganda to be spread. It is an ideological concept that relies on communication in order to exercise its power. And the way that we see fascism is spread currently is through the language of anti-terror, right? So the state identifies a threat, it tags it as terror, and it invokes a security approach. So Imbong, in this particular reading that I had shared uses the case of the Philippines, right? Where the Marcos and Duterte administration use an institution that they call the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC, in order to target environmental activists, right? And this was used particularly through a very specific policy, right, which was the national security policy, that was utilized as a basis for collective action, and which historically, for the first time, named social media as as playing a crucial role in national security, right? And this collective action sees itself as a whole of society approach. In order for the government to secure the people, everyone has to participate. And Ibong says that this omnipresence now of social media occurs through, or of digital fascism occurs through two ways, right? Through the organizational and through the technical. Through the organization level, digital fascism, or rather the policy, mobilizes multi-level state actors and rallies them around a particular narrative. It operationalizes this narrative at the institutional level. So this particular national security policy invoked not only the executive branch, but it also invoked all the government agencies, including the local government units in the Philippines, to utilize social media in order to establish this policy and to impose this narrative. The second aspect is the technical aspect, right? Digital fascism takes advantage of the nature of social media. So you literally have centralized transmission in your hand 24/7. And this very individual consumption, this mobile privatization, and this individualized reception of the narrative ensures that you're constantly, whether conscious or not, being dispatched this particular narrative. And so David Orbach has this concept he calls the meganet, which is exactly how the internet works. He says a meganet is a persistent, evolving, opaque body that controls how we see the world. And it relies on three things. It relies on volume, velocity, and virality. Very much like the internet. So when we talk about volume, we're talking about the large amount of data, and the capacity of the internet to store unthinkable qualities of information. And so this allows for the persistent and almost infinite creation and distribution of internet content. When we talk about velocity, we consider the speed in which reaction is triggered before reflection. And so the infrastructure itself is designed for your emotional judgment before your reflective consideration. And this is inherently linked to virality. Your public engagement, your distribution through reactions, comments, shares creates a multiplier effect. And so the reason why why I wanted to highlight how exactly this meganet works is because this is the ecosystem in which we try to converse and we try to change people's minds. And so there's this New Yorker essay by Gia Tolentino called My Brain Finally Broke. And I highly recommend reading it for a bit of solidarity. And if you're like me, who has been for the past how many years struggling cognitively to retain memories a bit more, I feel like you'd find a bit of comfort in realizing that unfortunately it is the society and it is the infrastructure that we engage with, that has contributed to this, I think, cognitive decline. It should be studied, quite honestly. So I'll read some of the excerpts that I think are quite striking and are, very important for our conversation today. So she starts the essay by saying, I feel a troubling kind of opacity in my brain lately. as if reality were becoming illegible, as if language were a vessel with holes in the bottom and meaning was leaking all over the floor. I mostly keep track of it on my phone, a device that makes me feel like I am strapped flat to the board of an unreal present. The past has vanished, the future is inconceivable, and my eyes are clamped open to view the endlessly resupplied now. So this is how she describes scrolling or doom scrolling. And she ends the essay by saying, I suspect I'll remember, probably dimly, a week at the end of March 2025 as a watershed moment. OpenAI had just introduced new image generation tools for ChatGPT. Users could now turn photographs into Studio Ghibli-style illustrations, snapshots from their weddings, for instance, or of their kids, and then inevitably pictures of Columbine and 9/11. The trend reached its grotesque apex when the official White House account tweeted a Ghibli-fied illustration of an officer handcuffing a sobbing woman, an undocumented immigrant who'd been convicted on drug trafficking charges and had recently been arrested by ICE. The post was a joke, and perhaps an effective one, maximizing the distance between Studio Ghibli's tender, bittersweet, profoundly human ethos and the gleeful, dehumanizing viciousness that is Trump's stock in trade. The image appeared on my feed in the midst of a bunch of bullshit, and then I refreshed. And as intended, it disappeared. Which brings us to the next part, which is the soundbite, right? I will make a explicit connection between the two, but I kind of want to bring your attention to why the soundbite is something we should just be conscious of, but something that we should beware, right? When we think about the soundbite, existing within this ecosystem, knowing now what this digital infrastructure looks like, how it works, knowing how digital fascism entrenches its power. Why should we now beware the soundbite? What are the consequences of this? So the power of the media is that it is able to dictate newsworthiness, right? It's an ability to decide what is important for the public to know, based on their own discernment, right, among the many events that occur in our society and our world, often based on a moral obligation of holding the powerful to account. So the construction of any event as news is therefore wrapped up in a set of values as determined by the media organization. So based on what they believe is important for the public to know, based on what they believe are transgressions, which are contextualized by a certain set of values, is how they determine what newsworthiness is. But now that you're competing with a social media algorithm, you're competing with the autoplay function, with an overwhelming amount of content fighting for your attention, the media has no choice but to engage in this game in order to capture your attention. And it does that through the soundbite. So Lee has this, what he calls the life cycle of iconic sound bites, right? And it first begins with the media framing the transgression. So a sound bite always has to do with transgression, in relation to a social event or in relation to how do you say, like a mistake that the politician has articulated, right? So the media constructs, it frames this as transgression by releasing and distributing the soundbite, and the public decides now if this is indeed transgressive. So there is contestation and negotiation that occurs. And if they believe that the soundbite is a transgression indeed or is significant to them, then there's a process of recycling. The iconic soundbite, which has now been decontextualized from its initial utterance, is now recycled and distributed and used for whatever purpose. So even the soundbite itself, or the selection of the soundbite itself, assumes a very specific set of values. And I want to emphasize the word assumes, because the soundbite itself assumes that we all share the same set of values, the same worldviews, and the same set of beliefs, right? And so, considering now the attention economy, the soundbite has now become the primary means of news. I myself am guilty of this, but many of us tend to rely on the headline to deliver the whole story, right? And although, we're talking about how media enables the soundbite culture, I kind of invite you to reflect about how this soundbite culture is lived, in our own participation or in our own interaction with social media content, right? This participation, such as through comments, stories, tweets, TikToks, or short, emotional, they evoke laughter, tears, or annoyance. Participation that is quick and that is easily consumable. And I want to emphasize that even our participation is meant to be consumed by others within this infrastructure, right? So what happens now when the decontextualized soundbite is inserted in this ecosystem of brief exposure and quick deliberation, right? When you rely on the autoplay function to distribute resistance, advocacy, and change. So I'm going to share just two headlines, example headlines for you. And these are headlines and soundbites chosen by our Philippine local media news company, Rappler. So Rappler, you might possibly have heard of it before because its founder was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, I think in 2022, I believe, very recently, Maria Ressa. So she was constantly harassed by the Duterte administration. She was constantly being slapped with libel charges. And her indignant belief of having to hold the line is what ultimately led to her Nobel Peace Prize award. Okay. So Rappler had a series of headlines, and I don't mean to crap on Rappler specifically, but because they were so it's so clear what their intention was, because they positioned themselves as holding the threat accountable, that you're able to understand the disparity now between what they were trying to do and what was actually happening. Right. And so Rappler rather would have headlines like this: Duterte to foreign critics, do not F with our dignity. They also had Duterte's tirades versus United States. You are useless. I'll set you on fire. Um, Duterte, I'm being portrayed as a cousin of Hitler. And my favorite one, Duterte to European Union, F you. That was it. That was the headline. No context whatsoever. Right. So let's try to break this down, this particular soundbite down. So you have the mention of foreign critics, right? So there's an emphasis on the external. And usually when we think of foreign, we think of Western, right? The quote, do not F with our dignity. It's a strong statement, and it puts Filipinos first. It puts Filipino dignity first, right? So what is the transgression now that Rappler is trying to highlight by making this the headline or selecting this as the ultimate soundbite? What is the transgression? It is undiplomatic, it's crass, it's embarrassing because he's representing us on the world stage at a conference in Tokyo, right? But without that context, if you focus only on the words, it almost presents itself as a decolonial, anti-establishment, revolutionary, man of the people statement, right? And so to focus on the swearing misses not only the point, but the proposed transgression which it aimed to highlight is lost, especially in a culture where swearing is possibly not even that big a deal, right? The transgression now falls flat. And so if I come from a subculture that does not see swearing as abnormal, as impolite, as shocking, then I'm not able to share in the transgression that this soundbite wanted to highlight. Let's do another example. Pia Cayetano. Duterte has done a lot for women's rights. So a bit of context, Pia Cayetano is a senator who throughout her career has positioned herself as a women's advocate. And she's had a long career. She's a veteran senator. She was senator from 2004 to 2016, and again from 2019 to 2025. So that's around 18 years, almost 20 years of being a senator. And she's established that brand of being a women's rights advocate. And so, again, what is the transgression that Rappler is trying to highlight in selecting this particular headline, right? It's to mock her feminism, to highlight her hypocrisy of supporting a misogynist like Duterte, who is known for his rape jokes, for his public harassment of women, etc. But without context, without even considering these jokes as transgressive, what the headline does is that it recycles and distributes the propaganda. And so all I see is a legitimate voice saying that Duterte has done a lot for women's rights, right? And so this is what I mean when I say that the soundbite assumes a set of values. It assumes that we share the same beliefs and that if it is to introduce a soundbite by itself on its own, decontextualized, you will understand what the transgression is. Right? So if you introduce the inherently decontextualized soundbite into a digital ecosystem, such as what we have now, you replicate, reproduce, distribute, and amplify that propaganda. Right, and I just want to share this quote by George Bernard Shaw, an Irish playwright. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place, right? So you introduce a decontextualized soundbite with the intention of advocating for change or holding someone to account within this infrastructure, based on the assumption alone that you share the same set of values, there is a failure of communication, right? And we can see that in our culture, right? In our political discourse. We assume and project the worst caricatures of each other, interacting with each other on the basis of identities and all its attached stereotypes that come with it. No longer nurturing care or curiosity about the people we don't know or understand. So we carry the illusion that discourse is taking place, but really we're having very different conversations. Right. And so now for our final part, the realm of community. And so I want to introduce you to this idea of care, solutions, and action. Care is something we can only develop through a sense of community, right? And I'm not going to tell you how to go about building your community. But what's important to highlight is that, or to emphasize, is that we need to develop a sense of responsibility, of care, of concern for other people. And that feeling of care can only be made genuine when we are prepared to be led by curiosity, right? So how do you develop that sense of care? So there's this book by Dr. Sarah Stein Lubrano called Don't Talk About Politics. And she talks about how the nature of our political conversations now. And she says that it's characterized by reasoning as war or as commerce. When you talk about reasoning as war, you are constantly fighting to prove your point with the ultimate aspiration for victory, right? And when you talk about reasoning as commerce, you're constantly selling your ideas to others and you're constantly being sold ideas as well. And so it's very transactional. And the goal really isn't to collaborate. The goal isn't to understand one another. The goal isn't to coexist, but is for one thing or one idea to dominate another. And she introduces this idea of action possibility, right? How can we, through our actions, or how can possibilities rather begin to emerge through our actions, right? How can we concretely begin through action rather than discourse, create a sense or create a shared path towards concrete solutions, right? And she says the first thing we have to do is develop a relationship, right? Develop a community. So through her research, she points out that people are only likely to change their minds if they feel like they're not being convinced or manipulated. They want to have that sense of agency. And the only time they can feel that they have that sense of agency and now that willingness to change their minds is if this person that they are speaking with has developed a relationship to them, someone they are quite close to, someone they value. And it's only through the community, through this attitude of caring for the well-being of one another, rather than trying to dominate each other's political beliefs, can this action possibility emerge, right? And so there's this framework that I have been trying to name. I used to call it, I think when I had initially sent the abstract, I'd called it internal logics, but now I kind of want to talk about it as fragmenting logics. And, it might change again in the future, but I think this image of fragmentation, it's something we fear, we always hope to be unified, to be, um, to be to be unified, to be together. And that's our image and our understanding of peace. To be freer fragmentation, and the consequences of that is we tend to universalize, we tend to homogenize, right? And so by fragmenting logics, or by the idea of, or by the imagery of fragmenting, we kind of return a sense of agency to every person that we interact with, right? And so there's a bit of wordplay here that I think I was so proud of myself for coming up with. And I say when we homogenize, we monopolize, but if we lament, we fragment. So when we homogenize a group, when we universalize, when we create a monolith of a certain type of people based on a very particular behavior, what we do is we lend power or we empower the most powerful, the most visible members of that particular group. And we give them monopoly of how this group interacts and reasons in the world. But alternatively, if we lament, if we proceed with curiosity, if we reflect, if we are genuine about trying to understand, then a kind of fragmentation occurs. We now begin to see the different logics, the different particular lived experiences that people use in rationalizing their decisions. Right? And these are just a set. I don't mean for this to be a checklist, but rather a framework, a place where we can begin to think about or to consider how and why people have rationalized or negotiated their political behavior stances or choices, right? If you consider their age, their gender, their socioeconomic class, their cultural context, their generational context, their worldview, their lived experiences, power dynamics in which they've made this decision, and perhaps their imagined futures as well. If we do that, if we bring this framework to each and every interaction, then we can begin to see, or we can begin to return agency to people again. And then we can begin to develop genuine, authentic relationships once more. And now we can view vulnerability as an eternal interaction, right? Rather than seeing vulnerability as a checklist responsive to genuine needs, just trying to tick it off to make sure that they're included. We can see it instead as a framework to understand where to begin, but to constantly be curious, to be cautious of how these vulnerabilities might emerge. So I want to give you a particular example. I hadn't sent it as a reading, but if you're interested in reading the journal article, it's called Limits of Solidarity by Leslie Gill. And she talks about the Coca-Cola scandal from 2001 to 2007 in Colombia, where there were abuses happening in their factories in Colombia. And there was a transnational movement between US student activists and Colombian unionists. Right? And she was talking about the disparity now of the two movements, right? The US student activists had a moral outrage at the political violence that was occurring in Colombia, and they used the language of human rights to frame the victimization of Colombian workers. And so these US student activists were middle-class students, consumers, who wanted to take action now against Coca-Cola Company. And they shaped the demands, the transnational demands of this campaign within this framework of human rights. But this kind of labor philanthropy on behalf of Colombian workers could not substitute for the labor solidarity that the trade unionists of Colombia themselves requested of Northern activists. Right? They struggled with them. They struggled with their workers' interests, right? Vis-a-vis the state and global corporations. And the Colombian unionists believed more than a human rights struggle, this was a class struggle. And so their concerns were labor-oriented, worker well-being oriented. But the ones who had captured the message of the campaign and had now captured the negotiation and the demands on the international front, because Coca-Cola is a global corporation, were the US student activists. And although the US student activists had strongly believed that they were fighting on behalf of the Colombian workers, because there was no reflection on the logic behind the unions mobilizing in the first place, then the genuine needs of the Colombian workers are obscured, right? And that's how co-option of movements occur. And that's how miscommunication between groups occur. It's because it's purely based on assumption. It's purely based on your own individual values and beliefs, rather in that constant interaction of trying to understand, right? So ultimately, learning and caring are never static. They're never fixed. They're never final. And in order for us to embody solidarity and to engage in solidarity, it relies on this continuous interaction with one another, right? And so that leads us now to the realm of solutions, right? In order for us to enact, to propose, to advocate for genuine solutions, for solutions that are truly responsive to the advocacies that we claim to be a part of, or to seek, or to speak on behalf, you constantly have to be engaging in this process. You have to constantly be engaging in care. You have to constantly be checking based on these relationships, not just the viability, but the effectivity and the genuineness, the authenticity of these solutions. And it must always relate to action. You have to kind of look beyond social media, Because if you try to enact change merely through a structure or through a system, right, that is designed for us to miscommunicate with one another, then there isn't any progress that you can concrete progress that you could hope for, right? We have to transcend social media and we have to return back to community care. And it really does begin with developing relationships with people around you that don't necessarily agree with you. The willingness to engage in complexity, in the difficulty of relationships, is a human fact, right? That's kind of been eroded by the culture that social media has fostered or has propagated and has nurtured, right? And if there's any place to begin resisting, it isn't by merely participating online and merely reacting and merely distributing. It is by willing, really, ultimately, to care about other people who don't think like you again, right? Because there are more people who aren't at the extremes, right? The illusion that we are a completely polarized world, or rather the sentiment that we are a completely polarized world is also an illusion, right? And that's where you have to begin resisting any sort of system and enacting kind of any change, is by looking beyond the extremes of the political spectrum and to begin to build again with people who genuinely, and more often than not, really just seek a better life and seek community and seek relationships and want coexistence and want the best for their families. And so although, the ending is quite a bit cheesy, I do hope I've been able to break down to you why it's necessary, and the importance of it and the consequences of not wanting to engage with people who are different from us or who believe differently. So that's all I have to say on the topic. I hope that was useful, and I'm happy to discuss further.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm now going to invite Chetna, the discussant for the session, to go ahead and raise the questions and any comments that she'd have from the talk. Thank you, Chetna, and thank you, Jenny, once again.
Hello, Eugenie. First of all, thank you so much for sharing such a robust list of articles. While I was reading them, I was very intrigued about how you would connect all three of them because the first and second I could draw a link with iconic soundbites and then fascism. But then vulnerability, how to bring that into this theme, I was very intrigued, and I'm glad that you could tie it all together in a synergetic way. Um, so my first question is about, it's actually drawn from the last meta we had, which was about women, how they are incarcerated in prisons. So then a question was raised about memory. And from that, so I'm thinking, so fascist forces also incorporate tools to selectively memorialize some aspects of history. And so, in such a state, especially in the Verde Marcos family feud I was reading up, what role then does collective memory, both its construction and its erasure also? At times, there is an erasure of historical moments. So, what role does this collective memory play in digital fascism? And particularly in the ways that online technologies mediate or distort or weaponize historical narratives or the way we see history. So, how does this how is this tool used to erase histories of oppression or suppress counter memories? Because of course, fascist forces are the status quo, right? So then, how do they incorporate the tool of memory, selective memorialization?
Um, so as I mentioned earlier, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Approached Cambridge Analytica actually with the intention to rebrand his family. So he wanted to change the memory of how people viewed the martial law period and frame it as a golden, as a golden age. And what or the role of digital fascism in kind of shaping that collective memory is really in its selection. It's able to frame very particular experiences that are distant from the remembering public, right? You have a public, you have a generation that has no longer lived through those experiences, who are reliant on our oral and our published history, printed history, to think about that period, right? And if now the culture encourages the public to rely merely on digital infrastructure for its information more than legitimate sources like books, right? Then they're more malleable to disinformation. The David Orbach's concept of meganets, right? He talked about volume, velocity, and virality. A large part of what Cambridge Analytica or PR companies like Cambridge Analytica does is that, or do, is that they rely on bombarding people with content that is crafted to your specific data, to your specific interests. So actually, when I talked about fragmenting logics, that's probably a more human version of exactly what the internet does, right? Is that it crafts everything to absolute, it crafts all the information you receive based on the data, based on these lived experiences that you've converted into some sort of data on the internet, into the basis of the kind of information it feeds you, right? And so if you're bombarded with this kind of disinformation, and this forms an intimate part of your reality, your everyday reality, then that does shape the kind of memory that you begin to adopt, or that you begin to believe in, right? Or the kind of narrative you begin to believe in. But it doesn't only rely on bombardment, it also relies on a particular frustration or a particular need that has gone unaddressed, right? If currently, so for example, in the Philippines, if you are frustrated, right? And I think this goes for quite connected, I suppose, with more global conversations about the failure of neoliberalism, right? If you are frustrated with a promise with promises that have been made to you, right? And so, for example, in the context of Philippine martial law, after the People Power Revolution, there was a promise. There were promises attached to democracy. There were promises that now that we're a democratic country, you can look to a better life. You will see quality of life improve. You will be more empowered in your political decisions. And really, most of the time, these conversations are so economically intimate, is you will economically rise up from your current socioeconomic class, right? And that's the promise of democracy. That's the promise of neoliberalism. But if you don't see that happening, and we are at a particular point of frustration, right? Then particular narratives become more effective, right? The idea that at this time, this nostalgic time, martial law had actually delivered on specific promises. The society at the time during martial law looked like a particular way. So not only does digital fascism capitalize on your distance from the event, not only does it rely on the volume or the bombardment of information, right? But it also relies on half-truths, because there were parts of the Philippines that were unaffected by martial law. There were parts of the Philippines that didn't feel the impact of, the political killings, the rapes, the tortures. There were some, the bailiwick, or the hometown of Marcos, thrived, was very rich during the martial law period. And so, because of the way the digital infrastructure works, is it so reliant on these half-truths? Because it's hard to contest half-truths unless you contextualize it, right? Unless you contextualize, you can't disagree with the fact itself. And so I think like all of these, it was quite a lengthy answer, I'm sorry, but I think like all these factors coming together is kind of how memory is distorted through digital fascism, right? And the infrastructure makes it very easy to to allow that to flourish, to allow that kind of memory to flourish. I hope that answered your
Thank you.
question.
Yes, I did get an idea. I'm so sorry, I'm turning off my camera. My internet is poor, so uh, I'm so sorry about that. I had to change my network. So, so then what is the solution? Because I was wondering, and this might seem very utopian, because so we want to evade fascism, we want to end it, right? And so, do you think that it's possible to then deplatform fascism? It would be a tightrope, but is it I was just thinking out loud. Do you think that forces that claim to be liberal democratic or anti-authoritarian actors, do you think that they can use, is it possible to use mechanisms of exclusion, for instance, content bans or account suspensions, without still reproducing the very authoritarian logics of silencing and historical amnesia and erasure that they want to resist? They want to resist those efforts. So how do you think that liberal democracies can walk this tightrope of wanting to suppress fascism, but at the same time not co-opting into the logics of silencing and erasure and coercion?
Right. I think it's very difficult given the algorithm, right? Essentially, the social media sphere gives the illusion that it is purely democratic, that it is a purely equal space, but it's not, right? You have big businesses, you have bureaucracies, you have powerful political actors funding, channeling money into how that information is distributed and what kind of information gets more attention, right? And there are systems for it. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but a lot of PR companies, right? They falsify comments, they falsify likes, and usually what is more popular is what gets more attention. So I think the point I was making with about the digital fascist ecosystem is that it is a system, and it's so difficult to work within a system where you are not the most powerful. So unless the billionaires of the world decide that they would like to be fair and free and democratic, I think it's very difficult, right? Um, but I think that's why I proposed at the end the need to look beyond social media is because we take for granted the two spheres, right? We always think that, or because social media has, captured so much of our lives, we believe that the starting point should always be social media. And right, we always look at it from a singular, linear perspective of like what happens in social media translates into the real world. But we fail to look at how what happens in the real world can shape our social media habits, right? And so I have a friend actually who was telling me that her mom, who voted for the opposition against Marcos in the last national elections, after she had moved out, was mostly on social media and started to think, maybe Duterte is okay, actually. Like, I kind of feel bad that he's been arrested by the ICC. He's an old man. Maybe he isn't as bad as I thought he was. Um, but once my friend moved back in again, then her political views had changed. And not to say that her mom has no agency, But the point is that realm of interaction is crucial to how political beliefs are constructed, right? And so I personally, I don't think the question should just be what is it about social media? How can we change the algorithm? How can we, overcome all these, how can we overcome big money's political interests? Because really the interest will only be money, right? Will only be profit. But instead, we should look at how, in the offline world, in our real lives, we can begin to restructure the way we interact, or return to meeting people um, across interests, across needs, um, beyond whether or not they're on the left and the right, right? And I feel like this is cliche advice. This is a cliche point to keep on making, but I still see the consequences of very polarized thinking, right? Um, Yesterday I had a conversation with a friend who was talking about her cohort in her grad school, and she goes to an art school, right? And so many of them are like, hard left, activists, but they have one white conservative Christian classmate. And so they've kind of isolated him. They don't believe, that they'll have anything in common. And so they don't talk to him. But my friend made the effort to befriend him. And the group or like her classmates were like, what do you guys even talk about? Like, what is there to what is there to talk about? Like, you have nothing in common with him. And she was like, oh, but we like the same movies actually, or we like the same video games, something like that. And she was listing like all the guys' interests and hobbies, and the people in her cohort were so shocked. They were like, how is he, a white conservative Christian, who has the hobbies of someone on the left? I was like, what do you like when I heard that, I was so surprised. I was like, what do you mean? But you see, that's how compartmentalized and polarized our thinking has become. That we only interact through these monolithic group identities, right? If a person is a Trump supporter, if a person is a Modi supporter, if a person is, you know, or if a person is pro-gun or I'm trying to think of more, popular political behaviors. If the person is uncomfortable using pronouns, say, then surely there's nothing else about them that I can find common ground with, right? And that's just the reality of the world. More often than not, this is how people are thinking through these very stringent categories, right? And that's why I propose this idea of fragmenting logics, because if we can begin to see people again as complex individuals, if we can see communities as complex as well, as having many different types of people with many different beliefs within the same group, then possibilities emerge, in ways that are just completely obscured or invisible. And so, although it sounds, again, very cliche, quite cheesy, it's something that I think really shouldn't be taken for granted. And there really should be more emphasis on, the material world more than the digital world.
So, drawing from what you're saying, that there needs to be more interaction and receptivity. That's where vulnerability comes in, right? As a effective tool to counter fascism, which is also one of the articles states that vulnerability can be harnessed to promote citizens' collectives that will then champion for deliberative democracy, right? The third article. So great, vulnerability is important. And one of the points of the article is that because different groups are differentially vulnerable and everybody may not have the same level of vulnerability, we need to have vulnerability mitigating mechanisms like extra concessions or caregiving support, compensation for the people who come together to form these collectives. So these supportive apparatus could be financial compensation, travel allowance, or targeted inclusion. So through these tools, you can ensure inclusion of a larger representational group of people in your citizen collective to counter fascism. But then, while these interventions are very important and they aim to promote inclusion, do you think that they can also, at times, inadvertently risk pathologizing the vulnerable population, seeing them as seeing them as in need of a deficit? They have a deficit that needs to be then cured. So how can so I was just thinking, how can institutions then avoid reinforcing this dependency model where the dependents, the vulnerable groups, are just seemed to be the ones who are pathologized or who need care, who need assistance? Because because you can't have that paternalistic view now, that you need to save them, you need to protect them. You can't be paternalistic like that. So how do we gauge that balance,
Right.
while also providing support to vulnerable groups, but then also not pathologizing them or being paternalistic in our assistance?
Well, two things, right? One is that I think the value of this reading is that it provides a framework, right, for vulnerability. It for understanding vulnerability. And I think the point really is that there is an emphasis on how we cannot assume the vulnerability of other people, the nature of the vulnerability of other people. So for example, right, there was one mention in the reading of the translators. So they had brought in translators so that for better interaction, or so that these special these women from these communities could understand the materials. But what was happening was, one, the male translator was co-opting the conversation, right? And he wasn't translating properly. And so that kind of impeded the way the woman got to interact as well. Or it was null. Basically, she wasn't interacting, right? When you think about it, she wasn't getting to participate at all. And so I think if we move from the mindset of, right, the checklist of, okay, person needs translator, check, done, that's it. But if you're not willing to constantly engage and to constantly interact um, with these vulnerable groups, then you're not genuine about trying to address this vulnerability, which connects to the second point about the reading, which is that it really has to be the vulnerable groups who lead the way, right? If you come into a community or into a group, or even just the idea that you're coming into a group to help the group is a display or is a working of power as well, right? But if you allow the vulnerable to lead the conversation, if you allow the vulnerable to articulate what it is exactly they need. Because the reason for coming together in a citizen collective is to address a particular need, right? And so um, there is nothing inherently wrong with being vulnerable. And I think the reading mentions Judith Butler's understanding of vulnerability, that it is an inherent character of our lives. So it isn't something to be eradicated, but it is something to contextualize the conversation. And so it's not necessarily coming in to save a particular group based on their vulnerabilities, but rather to use those vulnerabilities to understand what the need actually is. And so it isn't just, what I like about this framework is it isn't just, I think it's not only applicable to the design of how a conversation or how a collective or a town hall meeting is constructed, but it also provides a framework for how we interact with vulnerable groups, or how we interact with our communities as well. It's like, if we say we are activists and we want to enact a particular change and we want to collaborate with other people, are we being genuine? Are we getting to the heart of the true problem, right? Or are we simply imposing our own assumptions and values and beliefs on what we think the problem is? And so I think that is the problem, is that we think or we assume too much, right? Um, what the actual problem is. I'll just share a quick anecdote to kind of demonstrate that a bit further. I attended the Democracy Forum last year, and we were kind of discussing again social media. And I had brought up this, the problem of there not being time and space to reflect on nuance, right? And I said, because there's no time and space to reflect on nuance, you're not able to consider context. And one of the participants said, a white American woman said, "Excuse me, I think it's so unfair of you, of us um, uh, as pro-democracy activists to always put the blame on other people and, always call them stupid, that they're not thinking, blah, blah, blah. It's so unfair of us." But I was surprised because I wasn't referring to the other people. I was referring to us. And so again, that was a disposition of assumption as well, that you're talking about a particular group, or that, you're talking about, it's a disposition that is so fixed, like the frame is so fixed that it's unable or uncurious to understand the bigger picture of what it is you'd like to convey or like to say. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. I think these are all the questions I have. If I have any more, I'll type them out in the chat box. And now I'll leave the floor for any other questions that the participants may have. Thank you so much. It was lovely to read the three readings and all the bonus readings you also shared. So two of them were behind a paywall. It was difficult to access them, but
Oh
I got through
no.
one of them.
Okay, I can send
It would be
Sakshi the
lovely.
the
Yeah, it
link.
would be lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be lovely. And yes, thank you so much. It was lovely speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you as well for your questions. Yeah.
So now we'll open the forum for anybody else who would have questions. You can type them in the chat box. You could raise your icon. You could also just unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any. There's one in the chat box, which was again about the readings, Eugenie. So we've shared the link with the person so that they could go ahead and see the readings. Are there any questions in the chat box? I do realize that we've kept the participants a little longer than usually the Batak runs, but okay, if there aren't any, I was going to ask a question, Eugenie, if that's okay.
Okay, of
So,
course.
and in the meantime, other people could go ahead and use the chat box if they're interested. So, I was listening to your and Chetna's discussion, and one of the things that came to my mind was, well, it's really, you know, there is a normal conversation that goes around, which is that you cannot put the onus or the responsibility of being a bigger person on the person who's afflicted, right? The victim cannot have that bigger responsibility. But what happens in the situation, and specifically the anecdote, I think hits the hardest for me as a person, because I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about what's happening with fascism in the world right now, right? There are tangible consequences that individuals are facing because of fascism today. And it's not even country specific anymore. Like it's not an India question, it's not a UK question. It's so global, it's so rampant, and it's so hateful and tangibly hateful at this point that you can't really think about a conversation. I am thinking about the same space and coming to the same particular anecdote and thinking I would be I would have the conversation, or I would personally find it very difficult to talk to the white conservative person in the classroom because I would be scared for my safety. Think about it from the context of US today and thinking about the context of what's happening in immigration over there, right? Like, wow, they're just like picking students up. So you're worried to a point where I think that compassion, that sense of community, that kind of building is also coming from a space where the onus has all of a sudden fallen on the other half of this conversation, like the two poles, and somehow it's one pole's responsibility to take this. And I get why it's that pole's responsibility, okay? It's not that I don't understand why it's not. But the thing is that it's also seeking a kind of you know, uh, a kind of greater moral uh, space from the left or the assumed left or the non-fascist at this point, right? I don't even want to call it a left space.
Yeah,
That's also so
yeah.
difficult. So the non-fascists, the non-hateful now have the moral responsibility to be able to have this conversation. So how do we personally navigate those spaces? And it's not just individual personal navigations, right? It's also in public spaces. You're scared of posting a particular thing on social media because you are worried like what's going to be the consequence of this. On private accounts, which are not even public spaces, you're not sharing this because you want the world to know you're sharing this because you're like, hey friends, this is the two, three things that I thought were good. Or you're scared of posting the most basic things. You're scared of conversations. Like it's not funny, but amongst friends, one of the common things that people say today is your phone listening? Please watch what you're saying. Right? Like this is I'm sure everybody has had this kind of a conversation in that kind of fear apparatus, which is also originating from the fascist system. How do you then put the moral responsibility of communication? Compassionate communication. I don't know how else to say it.
I have several thoughts. One is that, right, because of, I keep on saying, yeah, the digital infrastructure, the way that the digital infrastructure is designed is to forward the most extreme content, right? And because it forwards the most extreme content, our perception of one another has been completely characterized by caricatures, by the most extreme understanding of one another. So, for example, if you are a Trump supporter, surely you are a misogynist. Surely you hate all immigrants. Surely you, all these all these assumptions tied to it, which isn't necessarily true, right? And so I think that's why there's this emphasis on fragmenting groups, is because you there are points of cooperation and collaboration that can emerge when you look beyond, right, these caricatures. And so the goal isn't to convince the most extreme people. The goal isn't to even develop community if you don't want to with the most extreme people. The goal is to find the good people. The these soft supporters, these people, for example, who sorry, and the only reason why I use the US as an example is because I feel like like we're both familiar with it, you know. So for example, with the Trump, there are people, right, who don't hate trans people, who want abortion, um who don't want their parents or their family or their neighbors deported. There are these people who've only seen the economic promises and the illusion that he's a peaceful, and that he's only concerned about the economy, that he will invest in their economic interests, that he will continue on developing the US in a way that hasn't been delivered, by past presidents. And there are these people, within any particular group, we can seek these soft supporters, these people who you can develop relationships with still, who aren't the extremes. So even that idea of like one side being good and one side being evil is also an illusion as well. It's so much more gray than we realize. Um, and so that's, when we break away from these extremes, then these relationships become possible as well. So it is also like a change, I think a restructuring of our worldviews, of our understanding, because that's what the system has encouraged. It's what it's nurtured, that we think in these extremes of black and white and good and evil as well, right? But if you always come to the point of these people are evil, then the conversation ends there. What are you going to do against the evil, right? All the evil people in the world, like what will you do, right? Except to fight with one another until one side dies, which is, until you dominate the other side, which is particularly why we have so much increasing conflict in the world, why we seem to be so polarized, is because we're focused on that domination or on that extremes of good and evil. I wanted to add something to that, but hopefully I remember later. The second thing is that it becomes now a competition of lived experiences, right? I remember. So we each have our own concept of what good is or what is right, right? So there's this video, I can't remember by what social media group, but they put a pro-gun person in conversation with an anti-gun person, right? And the anti-gun person's child, I think, almost died in a school shooting, right? But the pro-gun individual's reasoning for wanting to be pro-gun was because someone had broken into his daughter's room in the middle of the night. And if he didn't have a gun, his daughter would have died. And so, although, these are very particular experiences, I think they just kind of illustrate the different perspectives that people are coming from. I think we take for granted the fact that people's lived experiences are so real for them, or whatever logic they use is so real for them. So even, for example, in Israel and Gaza, I know it's a very sensitive, charged topic. But if we end with all Israelis are evil, or if you're a Zionist, you're evil, or if you fear Palestinians, you're evil, if you end there, then the conversation ends there. But if you can begin to question why they feel that way, what is it about their environment or their culture that has made this feeling or this belief so real for them, then there are pathways to begin to not only understand, but to find common ground, right? But to the question of why is it always our responsibility, is because I think that is the advocacy now. I think that is the heart of it now. Because that's how digital fascism has changed the game, that it isn't just about advocating for these very specific issues, but it's about reflecting on what digital fascism has made of our society. And the fundamental problem that digital fascism has created is this fracturing, right? This your undesire to develop relationships with people who don't agree with everything on you is a product of digital fascism, right? That's what digital fascism wants. It's what it encourages, and it's what it rakes in money from, right? And so that is like the fundamental call of our times. Of course, I would like to believe, and I do believe, that there are people on the other side who seek the same thing as well, right? And at this point, as a part of our advocacy, it's, we need to find them and we need to have that conversation with them and, help them nurture the same attitude in their own communities as well, or with the people around them. Yes. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Eugenie. I don't think there are any questions in the chat box, and I think I'm just going to ask it once more. If there are any questions, please unmute yourself and ask. Okay, so I think this is it. Sakshi, would you want to thank Eugenie and yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eugenie, for the wonderful and insightful session on digital fascism and how communication plays a prominent role there. And thank you so much, Chetna, for being an amazing discussant as always and pointing out the very pertinent questions. And thank you so much to all our audience who have been patiently listening and probably considering and pondering over all that we have on the plate today. Thank you so much. So we hereby close the ninth session of the Dark Betuk, and we'll see you next week on Saturday.
Thank you
Thank
once
you
again,
so much
Eugenie.
to all of you as well.